Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. As you heard, my name is Brad Chamberlain. I'm here with my colleague today, Jade Abraham. I was originally going to give the talk, and I am going to give most of the talk, but we decided about a week ago that it would be fun to do a demo at some point, and I'm too terrified to do live demos, but Jade is very brave. So at some point, we'll give you a break listening from me. You can see a demo from Jade, and then we'll pick back up again. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about doing data science interactively, but not just on your desktop, but at massive scale. So using data set sizes that are larger than you could fit into your desktop or laptop's memory. And I'm going to be talking about Python, which I imagine most of you are familiar with to some greater or lesser extent, and then Arkouda, which is probably new to you and which is the main thing we'll be talking about today. And of course, it stopped working. There we go. Okay. So just a little bit about me. I'm a graduate of the University of Washington. I got my doctorate here in the computer science department, and I remain affiliated with the university as an affiliate professor with computer science. So if any of you at any point in your studies need someone who's kind of expert in high performance computing, supercomputers, languages and compilers for those things, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to serve as kind of an advisor in that capacity. While I was here, I worked on designing programming languages for large-scale parallel computing, and that's what I've continued to work on in my career as well. So basically, how can we make really large supercomputers easier to program and more like programming a laptop would be? I spent most of my career at Cray Inc., which, if you don't recognize that name, is a company that builds large supercomputers, some of the largest in the world. Cray was purchased by Hewlett-Packard Enterprise about 6 years ago, so kind of like last year in COVID years. And so I work for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise now, but still on languages to make large-scale computing easier than it typically is. And today we'll talk about Arkouda, which is an application that was written in the language that my team and I are developing. And so I'll be telling you a bit about that. Also mention, I'm happy to take questions as we go. It was suggested that maybe to not slow things down too much, we sort of stick to clarifying questions during the seminar. And then if you have longer questions at the end, we should have time for that. And then I don't know much about this seminar or who all of you are. So I wanted to start out with some questions. First, how many of you are either consider yourself data scientists or like data scientists in training? Okay, some. How many of you are computer scientists who are interested in data science as like sort of maybe a side area? Couple. And then how many of you are, I would say, applied scientists? I'm thinking like astronomers, physicists, whatever, who need to learn about data science as part of kind of your field and dealing with large amounts of data. Okay, that's most of you. Okay, great. And then one other question I wanted to ask is, how many of you are Python users or programmers? How many of you program in other languages than Python? Okay, and then how many of you have programmed a distributed memory system like a supercomputer or a cluster? I think HIAC is here on campus. Okay, so good. All right, very good. That's really helpful for me just to get a sense of who all of you are, so I appreciate that. My group does a lot of work in open source software. That's what we'll be talking about today. And we sort of work at the cusp of research and development. So I think there's some people who look at what we do and would consider it strictly development because we're building software and deploying it and supporting users. But the kind of software we're building is sort of cutting edge and very challenging by nature. And so that's what makes it a little researchy as well. And I guess because I'm speaking at a university, I felt the need to kind of phrase what we're going to be talking about today as a research question. So you can think of it as computer scientists and HPC experts, either sort of me and my group or those of you who identify that way in the room as well. What can we do? What can we be doing to enable people to do productive data science on massive data sets? So again, data sets that are so large that they wouldn't fit on your laptop without crashing it or crippling it in terms of its performance. And I'll use the phrase HPC from time to time in this talk. For me, that means high performance computing. If that's not an acronym you use, again, think supercomputers. So the motivation for Arkouda, which is the main thing I'll be talking to you about today, came about from a group who basically wanted to do data science in Python at massive scales. And the situation was essentially that they had a bunch of Python-based data scientists, and they had HPC-scale data science problems they wanted to solve. Things that were too big for like running pandas on their laptop, for example. And they had HPC systems on which they could run them. But the challenge there is how do you leverage your Python programmers to get that work done? And what I'm implying there is if you're familiar with Python, most of the time when Python runs fast, it's because the code actually isn't written in Python. It's in C, C++, Fortran, CUDA, something else lower level underneath, and Python's just providing an interface to it. But in addition to that, while Python has some support for parallelism, it's not really designed for kind of large-scale parallel programming, the kind that they needed to get their work done. So they looked at some of the solutions that were out there. They found that none of them were working for them, and they decided to build this thing called Arkouda instead. And so just to define what Arkouda is, essentially it's a Python library, like any other Python library, in the sense that you load the module named Arkouda, you start making calls into it, and you get your work done. And on the right here, I've got a little snippet of Arkouda code that just takes in a problem size and a seed, generates a random array of values, sorts that array, and then asserts that it's sorted. And this is a little kernel that we use for benchmarking to sort of see how fast can Arkouda sort, and I'll show you some results of that in a couple of slides. But again, what's kind of interesting and different about Arkouda is that where typically, again, a fast library like this would be implemented in C, Fortran, or C++, Arkouda is actually implemented so that it isn't running on your laptop, but it's actually running out on a server. That could be an HPC system, a supercomputer, a cloud instance. It could even be running on your laptop or a laptop right next to you. But for these really large scale runs, they'll be running out on the supercomputer. And so the idea is that you're writing what look like sort of normal calls to generate a random array, sort the array, things like that. But rather than doing it right here on your laptop, it's sending the command over to the server, allocating a massive array for you, filling it with random numbers, letting you know what that array is called, letting you sort it. And you're sort of interacting with that server back and forth. And that's what Jade will demonstrate a little bit later in the talk today. So a very different model of data science, I would say. And so one way you can think of Arkouda is it's essentially a scalable implementation of NumPy and Pandas routines for data scientists who want to run at these massive scales. And the other way you can think about it is it's a way to work with a supercomputer interactively from Python. And if for those of you who've worked with supercomputers or distributed systems, which a number of you have, probably the mode you're used to is like you compile a program, you launch it with Slurm, it goes into a queue, you go get some coffee or lunch, you come back, it tells you the results, or maybe you made a mistake, you change your code, you recompile, resubmit, and that's sort of the mode. And here in Arkouda, you're basically sitting in your Jupyter notebook or your Python prompt, typing a command, it's executing on the supercomputer, typing the next one, it's executing on the supercomputer. So you're basically interacting with the supercomputer as you go. And the data scientists who implemented Arkouda felt this was crucial because in data science, unlike the kinds of sciences I guess I've worked in more, it was very important to them to be able to experiment on their data, try something out, apply a filter, try a hypothesis, see what the result of that was, and then make actions based on that. And to do that in the human thought loop without losing their train of thought, right? Because a lot of times if you're kind of recompiling and resubmitting to the queue, it could be minutes or half hour before your job runs. And so you don't have that kind of instant feedback. And that was something they really needed. And again, that's very different than how most people use HPC systems, at least in my experience. All right, so that's a little bit about what Arkouda is. I told you I would show you some performance results. This is that argsort routine that I showed you. So generating a random array and then sorting it and then checking that it's sorted. And this is run on 3 different machines. The biggest one here in the dark blue is an HPE Cray EX. This is the current sort of HPE/Cray supercomputer of note. And this is running on up to 8,192 nodes, which is over 1 million processor cores. And we're sorting 256 terabytes of data in 30 seconds. So again, it's that interactivity we're talking about, right? Massive scales in terms of number of processors, massive scales in terms of the data set size, and yet we can sort it in a half a minute, which is something you're willing to wait around for. And I should say the reason we benchmark this Arkouda argsort is that argsort and group by tend to be the 2 operations that our data scientists were using most frequently that were very, very expensive. Doing other things like a histogram or just down selecting data, things like that, happen much more instantaneously. So this is one of the slower operations in Arkouda suite, if you will. So we're always looking at the performance and seeing how it scales and performs. All right, so hopefully this gives you just a taste that Arkouda can run at these massive scales. The other thing that's really cool about this is that on the server where this sort is implemented, that is implemented using 100 lines of Chapel code. Chapel is the language that me and my group have been working on developing, and I'll tell you more about it a little bit later in the talk. But I want to have you think about, like, are you aware of any sorts that could scale to, over 1 million cores, hundreds of terabytes of data, sort in 30 seconds, and can be written in 100 lines of code. And to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any such sorts, but I'm also not a data scientist, so maybe you know of something that I don't. But my theory is that this is the fastest per line of code sort in the world, probably. All right, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Arkouda. I've shown you that it's scalable. We can scale to hundreds of terabytes, thousands of compute nodes, and over 1 million processor cores. I've told you about how it's interactive, and again, you'll see that a little bit later on. It's also portable, so you can run Arkouda on a laptop, on a cluster, on the cloud, on a supercomputer. We've designed it to be able to run essentially anywhere. It's open source, so we do all of the development on GitHub. It's released under the MIT license, which is a very permissive license. So if you're intrigued by what you see today, you could download Arkouda and try it out on your laptop. It uses columnar data. So the data frames that Arkouda represents are essentially stored as distributed arrays, each one representing one column of data. And each column could have different types, like you could have an array of strings for one column, an array of floating point values for another. And for those of you who do data science, one of the questions we often get is what kinds of I/O formats are supported? And the answer is Parquet, which is the main one that we've focused on, and then comma-separated values in HDF5. So that's a quick introduction to Arkouda. We'll see a little bit more of it as we go on in the talk. Next, what I'm going to do is show you some performance and scaling comparisons to other ways that you might do this kind of data science. Then Jade will give you a live demo, and we'll talk a little bit about Arkouda being an extensible framework that other operations can be added to, and then I'll wrap up with some summary and next steps. So again, the next thing I'll talk about is performance and scaling comparisons. And what I'm going to do here is talk about other ways that you might do this kind of data frame style of computation in Python. So the first thing that might come to mind, if you're familiar with it, is pandas. Pandas is, in my mind, kind of the hallmark data frame software in Python, sort of what started the whole data frame movement almost. And in this project, what we did, actually some members of our team did, was they have a collaboration with Oak Ridge National Lab, where Oak Ridge is analyzing telemetry data from their Frontier supercomputer, which is the second fastest computer on the top 500 right now. And so this computer generates all sorts of data about how fast are things going and what's the temperature and what's going on. And that's the telemetry data. And what they wanted to do was analyze this to understand if they energy capped the GPUs, which is to say, gave them a budget that they couldn't go above, how would that affect the application performance? And this is something that the Oak Ridge team had been doing using pandas. And so what we did was translated their script from pandas into Arkouda. And then using the same data on a single node, Arkouda outperformed pandas by 3.5x, which is nice. It's not like probably life-changing, but it's nothing to sort of shrug off either. But the key here is that pandas is designed only to run on shared memory, so only on a single node, at least to my knowledge. And so, but Arkouda again can scale, right? So where pandas was sort of stuck at that problem size, with Arkouda, we could run it on 2 nodes, 4 nodes, 8 nodes, 16 nodes, doubling the amount of data each time. And so this is what we call a weak scaling graph, where sort of the best behavior would be a flat line, because as we double the data and the number of nodes, we have the same execution time. You can see most of the computations here are flat, other than that one in dark blue, which also affects the light purple at the top, which is the total time. That's actually the I/O step where we're reading the data in. In part, that's probably not scaling as well because disks are just a bottleneck in general. But actually, we also had some performance issues with our Parquet reader at this point that we've since addressed. And we haven't had a chance to rerun these, but I suspect that they would be faster and flatter at this point. Okay, so pandas is kind of an interesting comparison, but maybe not the most compelling because it doesn't support distributed memory. And as many of you may know, some other technologies that people might use in this space to run on distributed memory include things like Dask and Spark. And these are the kinds of technologies that Arkouda's developers considered using when they started the project and found it wasn't doing the job for them. What I'm going to show here is some performance experiments that my team did comparing Arkouda, Dask, and Spark. And there's a lot of data here. So just to kind of walk you through this, the left scatter plot is 32 node runs, so 32 compute nodes. The right one is 64 nodes, so twice as many nodes. And then the x-axis is different problem sizes, so 1 terabyte, 2 terabytes, or 4 terabytes of data. And the y-axis is time, so lower is better on this graph. And we ran kind of a bunch of experiments. Arkouda is in blue, Dask is in gold, and Spark is in green. And so what you can see is that on the left side of the graphs, when the problem size is smaller, there's some competitiveness, particularly between Dask and Arkouda. But the more we move to the right in terms of higher node counts or larger problem sizes, you see Arkouda really start to separate out from the pack, and these others to start taking much more time. So what we're going to do now is dive into the rightmost set of data here. So this is a 64 node run using 4 terabytes of data, and we're going to look at what is happening in these steps a little bit more detailed. So this computation we were running had 5 stages to it. The first one was reading in the data. The next 2 were kind of fairly simple, kind of histogram, sort of simple elemental types of computations. And then the last 2 are kind of like data frame join operations. So really kind of operations that require a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of communication, a lot of coordination. And the dotted line in these graphs is showing our sort of arbitrary interactivity threshold. So we're sort of saying we'd like things to finish within 2 minutes to meet a definition of interactivity. And that's a little bit arbitrary. If you're short on patience, maybe it should be lower than that. And you can see in this first run that the Arkouda run is generally below that threshold, except for the I/O step. I mentioned that our Parquet I/O had some slowness in it. We've since gone back and rerun that and accelerated it, brought it below that interactivity threshold. Although I think there's still more we could do to bring it down even lower. We're still looking into that. Meanwhile, the next 2 steps, you can see there's some cases where Arkouda is a little bit better, somewhere it's a little bit worse, but all the techniques are kind of neck and neck. And that's not too surprising. Again, those aren't very complex operations. But then once we get into these join operations, there's a really massive difference here. And in fact, let me zoom the data out so you can see how big the difference is. So again, the Arkouda is kind of performing very well and well within the interactivity limit. You can see the Spark and the Dask take many times more time as much as the Arkouda and Dask. Sorry, lost my, the Dask and the Spark take many times more than the Arkouda is what I was trying to say there. And not only that, but those lines show the variability from run to run. So not only are they slower, but there's a ton of variability between their fastest and slowest times. We haven't dug deep into why this difference exists, but I can tell you my hypothesis, which is that Arkouda is a very imperative language that when you tell it to do something, it goes and does it. It stores all of its data in core. So when you say, allocate me a 10 terabyte array, it goes and allocates that array. Fill it with random numbers, it fills it with random numbers. Whereas Dask and Spark tend to use more of a lazy evaluation approach. They sort of batch up operations and then do them all at once. I think they also tend to use out-of-core techniques a lot more, so they're maybe going to disk between operations a lot more. But anyway, that's my theory as to why there's this big performance gap between the two once you start doing these intensive operations. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jade and get some water for myself. And Jade's going to show you a little demo of using Arkouda interactively.
All right, and now comes the moment of truth when we see if my network connection is good enough to make this work. Let's see. Hope this is still running here. Maybe. All right, so for the most part, and look at that, it works. For the most part, we want Arkouda to be kind of a drop-in replacement for things like NumPy and Pandas, so that there's not a steep learning curve to moving from your local machine onto a supercomputer. So I'm going to run through kind of some examples of code. The code should, if you know anything about Pandas, the code should be very familiar. There might be, it might look ever so slightly different, but it should look the exact same as Pandas code. The one thing that I'll start with is I'm going to load in this Parquet data file of some squirrel data. This is a data set from, I think, 2018 in New York of about 3,000 squirrels, just community data set of squirrels doing different things in Central Park. So you can see I read this, I'm using Pandas. I can read this on my laptop pretty easily and just kind of load in the data. But I can also do this with Arkouda, and I'll start by doing this locally. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to launch my Arkouda server locally. So this is one version of Arkouda running locally. I can import Arkouda, and then I'm going to connect to that server. And once I've connected to the server, you can see stuff happening down here on the bottom. I can do that exact same operation, but instead of saying pd.readParquet, I can say ak.readParquet. And if I do that, I get the same result. And we can keep going with this. This probably isn't very exciting because you can just run it on your laptop. So I'm going to stop this server, and we will switch gears to the HPC system. So excellent, worked. So this is a 16-node InfiniBand cluster. It's got a lot of cores, got a lot of memory, a lot more resources than my MacBook has, so we can do more stuff with it. Oop, gotta switch file paths. There we go. So one thing you'll notice is it's taking a little bit more time. There's kind of two things that are happening here. One, I'm using 16 nodes for 3,000 data points, which is way overkill. And I'm going to get a lot of overhead. So that overhead is going to result in it being slower than it would for local. The other thing that's happening is because I'm pulling all of this data back to my laptop, that's a lot of data that has to come over the network to my laptop. So that is a slow operation, just network speeds and VPNs and all that fun stuff. So in general, you don't want to be pulling data from your Arkouda server down to your machine, especially if you've got a terabyte data set. You don't want to pull that to your laptop. So we'll keep going down here. One of the operations that Brad mentioned, group by, shows up a lot in this, and I can go ahead and take my data frame on the server. I can run group by, grabbing each squirrel has different fur color. I can grab each of those fur colors and then count up each of those squirrels. If you've used pandas, this is probably pretty familiar to you. Running something a little bit more complicated. We're going to look for each of these squirrels in their different shifts. So whether that's the morning or the evening, and we're going to categorize them based on what color they are and what are the various things that those squirrels were seen doing. Is that running, climbing, whatever it is that squirrels do. And I'll pause here, and I'm going to rerun my pandas data frame. So this is, again, now running locally, and I've got my data frame. And I can come down here and just kind of prove to you that the code is more or less the same. If I rerun group by with the normal panda data frame, and then I need to leave it select like this, and then count. So it's a little bit different. This is kind of an active area of work where trying to make the API of a pandas data frame identical to the Arkouda data frame, or the other way around, making Arkouda look more like pandas. So it is a seamless transition between Arkouda and pandas. So let me reload the data frame for the server, because that's much more interesting. And so again, I can create lots of interesting things like this friendliness score, which is an aggregation of various different data frames. The one thing I'll note here is kind of the use of this vector programming style. So rather than writing a loop and having to individually access each element, in pandas, that's slow because you're using Python code instead of normal optimized pandas routines. In Arkouda, the problem gets a lot worse, where you actually need to then pull the data from the server to your machine, do the operation, and then send it back to the server. So it becomes really, really important to make sure you're using these kinds of vectorized operations. And that was one of the big things with ORNL, is turning their scalar pandas script into something that can be vectorized and run on a supercomputer. So I can go ahead and run this and compute the top 5 friendliest squirrels in Central Park, which are those 5 squirrels. The other thing that Arkouda is really good at is kind of finding a needle in the haystack. So when you have terabytes and terabytes of data and you need to find one specific thing, if you try and downsample your data, you might lose the unique characteristics that make it possible to find that needle in the haystack. And so being able to compute on all of your data is really important. And so I can run this mostly complicated filter to look for what we're going to call a quirky squirrel that does various things. It's gray. It makes the squirrel noise, which is apparently a quas. and is eating or climbing. So we can find those quirky squirrels. The last thing that I will show here before I kind of show something big at scale is actually making graphs out of these. We all like to see pretty pictures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert my distributed data. So I'm going to select exactly what I want, and then I'm going to convert it to pandas. So I'm going to pull it down from the network on that supercomputer onto my laptop so that I can make a plot with it locally. There are techniques to make plots on the distributed data set, so you don't have to downsample that data or copy that data locally. I'm not going to show that today because that's much more involved, and that starts to get into the extensibility of, that's not a core part of Arkouda, but it's an add-on that someone has created for Arkouda to allow you to do those visualizations. But we'll run this, and it makes pre-graphs. So there's our distribution of squirrels. There's a lot more in here, and I'll point out and I'll put it up on the screen if people want to take a picture of it to look at this later. This is a small section of a Jupyter notebook that came from one of our colleagues, Shreyas. He has a video and a much larger notebook that has this code plus much, much more if you're interested in learning more and looking at this yourself. So I'll leave this for just another second so you can take a quick picture of that link if you want it. And so the last thing, what's really important is having kind of large scale data. So if I run this second command here, grabbing, I think this is 10 billion integers. This is, 75 gigabytes. There's no way that's going to fit on my laptop. But as you can see, Arkouda just did this effortlessly in 0.3 seconds, allocating 75 gigs. I can even, bump that up and hopefully it won't crash. There we go. So close to a terabyte, and it took a matter of seconds. And this is just not even something that you can come close to doing on your laptop. And that is everything I have for this demo section. I will hand it back off to Brad.
Any questions for Jade before we hand back? All right. Great. Thanks very much. That was impressive. I would never have been able to pull it off live. Maybe not even live, and you dodged the curse of the live demo. So thanks, Jade. All right. So the other topic I want to talk about, just doing a quick time check. Okay, is extending Arkouda. So as you've heard, initially Arkouda was developed to support these NumPy and Pandas APIs. But what the creators realized at some point was, well, gosh, there's a lot of other things that people might want to do interactively on a supercomputer using Python. Like, why limit it just to these APIs? And so what we've done over time is made it possible to extend the Arkouda server and the client to support new operations and also support new data types. And so a number of new capabilities have been added to Arkouda over time to do that, including multidimensional arrays, support for the Python array API or xarrays, for ZAR IO, for SciPy operations. Something I've been interested in is support for sparse matrices and sparse matrix multiplication, and then graph analytics. And Jade mentioned visualization as well, which I forgot about when I was putting this list together. There are others as well. But the point is, sort of, if you're like, well, there are other things I'd like to do interactively on a supercomputer from Python, it is possible to do that in Arkouda. I'm going to talk a little bit about graph analytics because I think it's interesting from a data science perspective, and it's also some of the more recent work that's happened here. And this is work done by colleagues of ours at New Jersey Institute of Technology. And their sort of hypothesis is that, data frames are all well and good, but other times there are other things you want to analyze when you're doing data science. And they're particularly interested in massive scale unstructured graphs, which are useful for things like community detection in large social graphs, categorizing NetFlow packets to distinguish malicious versus benign packets. And then something they've been working on a lot recently is finding subgraphs within neuroscience connectomes, which are like the graphs of the neurons in a brain, like a fruit fly's brain or a human's brain. So they've developed an Arkouda extension called Arachne that supports these unstructured graph computations. They found that the performance competes with or beats leading approaches. If you squint really hard, some of the pink text in that bottom slide talks about being 2,000 times faster than the state of the art. They have several different representations, including vertex and edge-centric representations of graphs. They have a bunch of standard graph algorithms such as breadth first search, triangle counting, connected components. And then with this brain analysis stuff that I mentioned, they've been doing a lot of subgraph isomorphism using a new parallel algorithm and a visualizer. If you're interested in more about this unstructured graph extension to Arkouda, the first reference here, which is what the first slide is from, is one of our team members who recently graduated with his PhD. Arachne was kind of the theme of his work. And then the next is a follow-on piece of work that does this neural graph matching that I mentioned. So yeah, one of the cooler extensions and more recent, just this past year. So returning to my key properties of Arkouda, I'll throw the last one onto this list that I'll talk about today, which is this notion of extensibility. We've just been talking about adding new features to the client and or server over time. And so something that you may have seen on the slide, maybe I mentioned it once, is the fact that the Arkouda server is written in this thing called Chapel. But I haven't really talked about what Chapel is. Again, maybe I mentioned briefly. So Chapel is the language that my team is developing, initially developed at Cray and now develops at HPE. And the goal of Chapel is to make supercomputing much more productive at scale. So to define Chapel a little bit, it's a modern parallel programming language. By modern, I mean most supercomputing is done using Fortran, C, or C++. Chapel is kind of post all of those languages. Think of it as more Python, Rust, Julia era of a language. It's portable and scalable. So like Arkouda, you can run it on a laptop. You can run it on a supercomputer. It's open source and collaborative. We do all of our development at GitHub. We release under the Apache 2.0 license. And recently, we've just announced that we've been accepted into the Linux Foundation, specifically within a sub-foundation called HPSF, or High Performance Software Foundation. This is a foundation that's devoted to HPC open source software, and we're very proud to be one of the newest members of that foundation. The two goals of Chapel are to support general parallel programming, which means if you have some parallel algorithm in mind and some parallel hardware you'd like to run it on, you should be able to do that in Chapel, or we're failing at that goal. And the other one is to make parallel programming at scale far more productive than it is today. And I'll do that quickly through this illustration, which I won't have a lot of time to go into. But just to give you an idea, some of you may have programmed in MPI. These are two standard HPC computations. They're fairly simple computations, but you can see they're a lot of code. And these are as they would be programmed in C and MPI, and the first one has some OpenMP as well. And the reason this is a lot of code is because C is low level and MPI is reasonably low level, and it imposes an SPMD programming model on the user, and that involves a lot of bookkeeping. And so there are a lot of details to manage, a lot of places to make mistakes in these benchmarks. So next I'm going to show you the equivalent Chapel code. So the blue code here is equivalent to the code you can barely read in these slides. And you can see it's not only actually readable, but you might even be able to understand it if you spent 5 minutes with it and figure out what these benchmarks are doing. It's high level, and a lot of that comes from the fact that we built Chapel to be a parallel language. So there are a lot of built-in features in the language and in the library that allow you to do things like create a distributed array or run a parallel loop over a distributed array. And that results in more succinct code and clearer code and much less error-prone code. And the other part of it is that despite the code being much shorter, it's also competitive with the MPI. So in the top graph, we're kind of neck and neck. In the bottom graph, we're actually outperforming MPI. So the point is not only is the code clean and short, but also performs and scales very well as well. This is one more modern example running on a larger data set, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just skip past it. The lesson's the same. Shorter code, scales out, outperforms the competition. So an interesting observation is that you could build Arkouda using any language you wanted to, right? If you are a C++ and MPI programmer, you could write Arkouda in that. All it has to do is talk to a client and run computations at scale. So a question you might ask is, well, why was Arkouda written in Chapel? And if you were to ask the authors, they would say, well, one of the big ones was productivity. They wanted to do this quickly and easily. They didn't really want to use MPI. But more than that, they were trying to appeal to Python programmers. And even though most of the users would be happy in their Jupyter notebook, if they wanted to go and extend Arkouda, they wanted to write it in a language that that person would not be repulsed by. And I would say a lot of Python programmers, in my experience, are kind of repulsed by C++ and MPI. And there have been some cases of people writing their first HPC codes in Chapel as a result of Arkouda. As I mentioned, it has parallelism and distributed arrays as first-class features. These were key building blocks for the data frames that Arkouda supported. They knew that the performance would be competitive with conventional approaches, so they wouldn't be throwing anything away there. They liked the portability. They did most of the development on their laptop, then they would recompile to run it on their supercomputers. And the last one we haven't really talked about today, but Chapel's interoperable. So if you have libraries or routines in C, C++, Fortran, or now even Python, you can call out to those libraries and reuse code rather than having to rewrite everything in Chapel. And that was huge because they knew if they wanted to do FFTs, they could just wrap FFTW and call into that rather than developing it themselves. If you'd like to hear more about the development of Arkouda, this is an interview we published on our blog with one of the co-founders of the project. He talks about what motivated the project and what motivated their use of Arkouda, what worked well for them, and things he'd like to see improve. And there are a couple of quotes here about where he talks about, he's on the verge of forcing himself to learn MPI when he learned about Chapel, and he decided he liked it a lot better, and that he just thinks it's the most natural way to think about parallel computing. So nice little blurb for us to throw up in talks like this. We've been talking today about Arkouda and Arachne. Before we leave Chapel, I just wanted to mention that there are a lot of other applications people are doing outside of the Arkouda framework in Chapel as well. Things like aircraft design, simulating the universe, image analysis for coral reef health, earth science, AI. So Chapel is proving to be very general purpose. Arkouda is just one of many applications that have been developed in it. And if you're interested in any of those other application areas, like if you work in one of those fields, this interview series that I mentioned with a bunch of our users lets you hear about their experiences using Chapel in their field. And a lot of those applications are covered in this series. I can't remember if I mentioned, I will make these slides available so these hyperlinks will actually work, though Googling might get you to most of them as well. All right, so let me wrap up and then I'll take some questions. To summarize what I hope you have heard and learned tonight, Arkouda is an open source Python library that allows you to drive HPC systems from Python, sort of a new mode of interacting with HPC systems. Arkouda operations, as I've shown you, have demonstrated scalability and interactivity, so running fast enough that we can sort of do operation after operation. The Arkouda framework is extensible, so I was originally developed to do NumPy and Pandas. More recent work, as you've seen, is focused on graph analytics, or I mentioned the sparse linear algebra, SciPy support, so on and so forth. And Arkouda was written in Chapel for the purposes of productivity, portability, and performance. I should say that you have enough to be dangerous now and go out and try out Arkouda or Chapel yourself. But given that we're local and you're local, we're also always happy to come over and pair program with people, sit down at a computer and walk you through some things or try some computations. And if that's of interest, please just let us know. This slide, I think I'll skip past in the interest of time. I want to leave time for questions, but this was just to show that our work is not done. And maybe a couple things I'll call out here. Chapel supports GPU computing, but to date, I'm not aware of any Arkouda extensions that have made use of GPUs. Part of the reason is that the big heavy hitters in historical Arkouda have been like the sorts and the group bys, which are very network intensive. And it's not obvious that GPUs would help a lot with the bottlenecks there. So there wasn't a lot of motivation to try them out. But it's not hard to imagine that other workloads would be really great to run on the GPUs and to be able to drive from Python. And so I think we just need to find the right workflow and operations to make use of GPUs. And the last thing I'll mention, may be obvious. Part of the reason we're here is that, like any good open source project, projects live or die based on their communities. And so we wanted to come over and tell you a little bit about Arkouda to see whether there are cases where you're like, oh, with that we could solve a problem we didn't think we could, or maybe solve it faster than we thought we would be able to. And so again, if you want to join the community of Arkouda's users or developers, please let us know. For more information about Arkouda, the three main things I'll point you to are the website, which is kind of just an overview, a lot of things you've heard about tonight. Again, that interview with Bill Roos, one of the co-founders of the project. And then we have an annual conference, and there was sort of a State of Arkouda talk that was given there. That was just a little over a month ago. And so that's a good way to get the latest news about Arkouda and what's been happening there. I just wanted to throw up that even though Jade and I are the two members of our team who got to come and speak to you tonight, this is the work of a lot of people on our team at HPE, as well as a lot of people in the community outside of HPE whose photos I didn't happen to have handy. But this is the team we work within, the advanced programming team at HPE. And then this is just a list of, if Chapel was intriguing to you outside of Arkouda, this is a bunch of ways to interact with the Chapel community, which, as you saw, is sort of larger than just Arkouda. Between things like weekly meetings that are public that you can attend, newsletters or blogs you can check out, our social media accounts if you want to follow along, or our YouTube channel where we have a bunch of recorded talks and demonstrations. And then a bunch of ways that users can get in touch with us with questions about using Chapel or problems that they're having. And I should say that even though these are all sort of Chapel resources, we welcome Arkouda questions there as well. So you're welcome to reach out if you're just an Arkouda user using any of these Chapel forums as well. With that, I'll go back to my summary slide and see if there are any questions. Thanks again for having us here tonight.